sprawling constructs of bewildering complexity made from blocks of hewn stone. The Mazemakers' constructions are scattered across the isles, and one, badly overgrown and sunk deep into the earth, has been found on Essos proper, on the peninsula south of Lorath. Lorath-ASOIAF, the second largest of the Lorath Isles, is home to a vast maze that fills more than 3/4 of the surface area of the island and includes 4 levels beneath the ground, with some passages descending 500 feet. Scholars still debate the purpose of these mazes. Were they fortifications, temples, towns, or did they serve some other, stranger purpose? The Mazemakers left no written records, so we shall never know. Their bones tell us they were massively built and larger than men, though not so large as giants. Some have suggested that mayhaps the Mazemakers were born of interbreeding between human men and giant women. We do not know why they disappeared, though Lorathi legend suggests they were destroyed by an enemy from the sea, Merlings in some versions of the tale, Selkies and Walrusmen in others. Hey everyone, Crowfood's daughter here, and if you click this video, you have reached the Disputed Lands. In today's video, we will be covering the Mazemakers of the Lorathi Isles. This video will be best understood if you have watched my previous video covering the Dothraki Sea, which I have linked below. So if you haven't done that already, go ahead and do that now. And for those already familiar with the Dothraki Sea video, today's topic was originally intended to be part of that video, but it was cut out due to length, with the full intention of making a part 2. And now here we are, at part 2. So today, we are going to be discussing the mysterious lost civilization of the Mazemakers of Lorath, who they were, and what caused their destruction. And in doing so, we will be discussing their connection to the base of the High Tower in Old Town, which may surprise you. Now let's get started. So, the Mazemakers. The Mazemakers were an ancient and long-vanished race who once inhabited the Lorathi Isles, a people said to have disappeared long before the dawn of true history, leaving no trace of themselves, save for their bones and the mazes they built. Of all the mysteries the World Book has presented, the Mazemakers are an especially tantalizing and thought-provoking one, because not only do we have an abnormally large, long-vanished race, but we also have complex architecture with subterranean passages, and we even have a legend recounting a conflict with an equally mysterious enemy from the sea, who are rumored to have caused their destruction. Now, the way we are introduced to the Mazemakers in the World Book is interestingly not within the Essos chapters as one would expect. Instead, the Mazemakers are first discussed within the Old Town chapter. You see, the base of the High Tower is a very ancient and peculiar structure with maze-like qualities. The nature of its purpose is unknown, and the building style at first glance is also perplexing. More troubling and more worthy of consideration are the arguments put forth by those who claim that the first fortress is not Valyrian at all. The fused black stone by which it is made suggests Valyria, but the plain, unadorned style of architecture does not, for the Dragon Lords loved little more than twisting stone into strange, fanciful, and ornate shapes. Within the narrow, twisting, windowless passages strike many as being tunnels rather than halls. It is very easy to get lost amongst their turnings. Mayhaps this is no more than a defensive measure designed to confound attackers, but it too is singularly un-Valyrian. The labyrinthine nature of its interior architecture has led Archmaester Quillian to suggest the fortress might have been the work of the Mazemakers, a mysterious people who left remnants of their vanished civilization upon Lorath in the Shivering Sea. The notion is intriguing, but raises more questions than it answers. From this passage, we are told the base of the High Tower appears to be of Valyrian origin, due to the fused black stone used in its construction. However, the problem that arises is that its style isn't Valyrian at all, and its maze-like qualities have at least one maester suggesting a possible connection to the mysterious Mazemaker race. Ultimately, due to the presence of at least one example of fused black stone in the Far East, the fandom has come to understand that the builders of the Hightower Maze likely originated not from Valyria, but rather from their pre-Valyrian ancestors, known as the Great Empire of the Dawn. The elaborate style the Valyrians favor is likely an evolution from the simpler, unadorned style previously developed by their forebears. Although incredibly intriguing, the notion of the Mazemakers having any connection to Old Town or the Great Empire is generally dismissed due to simple geography. In the Dawn Age, before the Hammer of the Waters, there would have been no feasible passageways for the Mazemakers to have landed on the western coast of Westeros due to the unbroken Arm of Dorne. To attempt to do so would have meant sailing the Shivering Sea along the northern coast of Essos an incredible distance, and once that had been traversed, these sailors would then have to cross the entirety of the Sunset Sea, and crossing the Sunset Sea is currently believed by many in Westeros to be a fool's folly. So the likelihood of an early maritime civilization performing this feat seems doubtful. Luckily, however, there is an answer to this conundrum. The key to this is the great inland sea that once stood where the grasslands now occupy, and the Fisher Queens who were said to rule it. The histories of those days are lost to us, sad to say, for the kingdoms of the grass came and went in large measure before the race of man became literate. Only the legends persist. From such we know of the Fisher Queens, who ruled the lands adjoining the Silver Sea, the great inland sea at the heart of the grasslands, from a floating palace that made its way endlessly around its shores. Sufficient tales survive to convince most maesters of the past existence of the Silver Sea, though because of diminishing rainfall over the centuries, it has shrunk so severely that today only 3 Great Lakes remain where once its waters glistened in the sun. So, according to the Grasslands chapter of the World Book, there was once a great inland sea where the Dothraki Sea is now located, and only 3 Great Lakes remain of this long-vanished sea. As discussed in my Dothraki Sea video, if you take a look at a map, you will see the 3 Great Lakes that are referred to are likely the 2 Great Lakes located within the Kingdom of Sarnor and the womb of the world itself. And if this is the case, then this Silver Sea was likely very, very large. But additionally, from what we know of the way grasslands and plains regions are formed, it's possible the Silver Sea was even larger than we realize. Now, if you recall, legend tells us that the Fisher Queens ruled the lands adjoining the Silver Sea from a floating palace that made its way endlessly around its shores. Like many legends in A Song of Ice and Fire, these tales of benevolent Fisher Queens floating around in palaces may actually be a corruption of a more feasible reality that has been conflated over time. While the possibility exists these palaces could have been some sort of Dawn Age version of Greywater Watch, which is said to be the floating keep of House Reed, the most realistic explanation for these legends of floating palaces is most likely an early account of ships, meaning that the Fisher Queens of legend were likely a seafaring people. And if the Silver Sea was truly a massive body of water, as the map suggests, this great sea might prove useful in allowing travel throughout several portions of the continent, as the rivers of the present timeline would have served as inlets or passages to both the Shivering and Summer Seas, making interaction between various civilizations possible. And interactions with other civilizations seems to be suggested, as their legend states that kings, lords, and wise men sought the Fisher Queens for their counsel. In addition to being seafaring, we know a lot more about the Fisher Queens than you might realize. For example, there are some clues that the Fisher Queen civilization may have been more advanced than their neighbors. The Fisher Queens were wise and benevolent and favored of the gods, we are told, and kings and lords and wise men sought the floating palace for their counsel. Beyond their domains, however, Other peoples rose and fell and fought, struggling for a place in the sun. Some maesters believe the first men originated here before beginning the long westward migration that took them across the arm of Dorne to Westeros. The Andals, too, may have arisen in the fertile fields south of the Silver Sea. Tales are told of the Hairy Men, a race of shaggy savage warriors who rode to battle on unicorns. Though larger than the Ibanies of present, they may well have been their forebears. We hear as well of the lost city Liber, where acolytes of a spider goddess and a serpent god fought an endless bloody war. East of them stood the kingdom of the centaurs, half man and half horse. Wise, benevolent, favored by the gods, with kings, lords, and wise men seeking their counsel, while other people rose and fell and struggled for a place in the sun. These other peoples are described as early ancestors or originators to the first men and Andals, as well as a savage race of hairy men and a kingdom of centaurs, which the World Book later explains was likely no more than mounted warriors, an early society who may have been the first to tame and ride horses. This description of an early mounted society around the vicinity of the Silver Sea also appears to be a good match for the Dothraki legend of the first man emerging from the womb of the world, riding on the back of the first horse, which may further suggest the womb of the world being one of the 3 Great Lakes that were once part of the now vanished Silver Sea. Another aspect that may be providing us with additional information about the Fisher Queens is the Sarnori. The Sarnori are a race known as the Tall Men, who were said to be descended from Azor-Ahai, who was born of the last of the Fisher Queens. This statement regarding the Sarnori and their progenitor represents a shift, the end of one people and culture, and the beginning of another. As you may have noticed from the name alone, there are implications that the Fisher Queens may have been a matriarchal society. The Sarnori are a culture that replaces the Fisher Queens, and are described as proud and quarrelsome, a warlike patriarchal society, with kings as their leaders who drove chariots driven by blood-red horses, while the Fisher Queens were described in fairly peaceful terms, such as wise and benevolent. I mean, when you think about it, we actually have a lot of information regarding the Fisher Queens and their society, except one important thing. Where did they come from? Seafaring cultures have an origin point, a place they call home, somewhere to settle their families, somewhere to refit, somewhere to build ships, and somewhere to offload their trade and plunder. In the case of the Ironborn, it's the Iron Islands. In the case of the Ibbanese, they are based out of Ib, and so on. So, if we are looking at a seafaring culture, then they had to have come from somewhere, right? When examining the map, with the potential size of the Silver Sea in mind, the possibilities are far from few. But we at least know they would have required some proximity to a coastline. When looking for clues as to their origin point, the Sarnori are a good place to start, as this culture is something of a descendant of the Fisher Queens, as their progenitor was said to descend from them, and, according to the World Book, it appears the kingdom of Sarnor was quite large. A proud and quarrelsome people, they were seldom ever united under a single ruler, but their kingdoms dominated the western grasslands, from the forest of Qohor to the eastern shores of the vanished Silver Sea and 50 leagues beyond. Presumptively, from what we know of the kingdom of Sarnor, we are looking at the northern portion of Essos that appears to cover the area of the forest of Qohor and what is now known as the Dothraki Sea. But there are some clues of Sarnori influence and presence even farther west. According to the World Book, Azor-Ahai took to wife the daughters of the greatest lords and kings of the Hill Kingdoms, the Gipps, the Cymeri, and the Zecora, binding all 3 peoples to his rule. It is said that his Cymeri wife made his armor, and that the Cymeri were the first to work iron. Due to the mention of hill kingdoms, and the Cymeri being the first to work iron, this has led many in the fandom to conclude that the Cymeri were the predecessors to the Rhoynish civilization, as the Rhoynish are also claimed to be the first civilization to work iron, and were once present as far west as the Velvet Hills, and as far north as Norvos. Now, what is interesting here is that there are also clues of Sarnori influence within the names of Rhoynish cities. As you may have noticed, many of the Sarnori cities have names that include either an ATH, such as Sath, Sarnath, Kasath, Sathar, Gornath, or Rathar, or SAR, such as Sarnath, Saris, the Sarn River, and the Kingdom of Sarnor. This influence can also be seen in the Valyrian outpost city of Asaria that at one point had bordered the Kingdom of Sarnor. What is interesting in the context of the Cimmeri is that we have several Rhoynish cities that have a similar naming convention, such as Nysar, Sarmel, and Sarhoy, which may be further evidence of Sarnori influence within their culture in the distant past. So it's quite possible the hill kingdom the Cimmeri were said to hail from was potentially the Velvet Hills that the early Rhoynar had at one time occupied. Now, with that being said, when looking at potential areas that the Fisher Queens may have originated, we have an area that appears to cover the northern portion of what is now the Dothraki Sea, and much of northwestern Essos, which still doesn't provide a lot of clues. The only thing we know is that it would have had to have been near a coastline of either the Silver Sea or the Shivering Sea, so still not a lot of help, and the possibilities are pretty much wide open. But what is interesting here is that when Lorath is considered, something else happens. Something starts to make sense. The Lovecraft References. As you may already be aware, the Sarnori are a race of people said to descend from the Fisher Queens, and the Sarnori capital city where the High King resided was Sarnath. In 1920, H.P. Lovecraft published a story about a great civilization that suddenly fell, with their people disappearing, called The Doom That Came to Sarnath. According to this tale, there was once a people who grew in wealth and power, and settled along a lakeshore, naming the settlement Sarnath. On the other side of the lake was the ancient city of Ib, that was peopled by an ugly fish-like race that worshipped a stone idol in the likeness of their water lizard god. The Sarnathi people eventually grew tired of the appearance and customs of their neighbor, and they slew the people of Ib, taking their idol as a trophy. The following night, the idol had vanished, and the high priest of Sarnath was found dead, with the word doom written on the wall. 1,000 years later, the doom did indeed come to Sarnath. It is thought that the ghosts of the slain people of Ib took revenge on the descendants of Sarnath, causing their destruction. Those who returned to investigate Sarnath found no people at all, but rather only empty marsh, water lizards, and the idol of the god of Ib that went missing so many years earlier. Now, our author pays tribute to this tale not only through the Sarnori with their capital city of Sarnath, but also the Ibbenese who hail from the Isle of Ib. So, for a moment, let's just toy with the idea that the kingdom of the Fisher Queens could at one point have been located on Lorath, and whatever survived of these people progressed into the people of Sarnor. We know in Lovecraft's story, the city of Sarnath was destroyed by what is believed to have been the spirits of Ib, their long-dead, odd-appearing fish-like neighbors. From what we know of Lorath, the mysterious Mazemakers were said to have been destroyed by an enemy from the sea, who are described as merlings in some versions of the tale, selkies and walrusmen in others, which sounds like odd-appearing fish-like people to me. But, as we all know, our author does like to play on the historical theory of mythology, and like the kingdoms of the centaurs, or the Fisher Queens floating around in palaces, this is likely a conflation of actual events that has been altered or corrupted in the retelling. And in this case, the most logical explanation for this enemy from the sea could simply be another seafaring culture. And coincidentally enough, aside from the Fisher Queens, the people of Ib are the only other civilization confirmed to have been a Dawn Age seafaring people in that vicinity. And if the Fisher Queens were an advanced seafaring culture who had control over large swaths of the waters of the Silver Sea and northern Essos for fishing and trade, the neighboring seafaring culture of Ib would have competed for the same waters. In another parallel, like the strange appearance of the people of Ib in The Doom That Came to Sarnath, our author stays within this motif, and the Ibbenese within his world are similarly depicted as an ugly race that stand apart from the other races of mankind. Their faces, characterized by sloping brows with heavy ridges, small sunken eyes, great square teeth, and massive jaws, seem brutish and ugly to Westerosi eyes, an impression heightened by their guttural, grunting tongue. But in truth, the men of Ib are a cunning folk, skilled craftsmen, able hunters and trackers, and doughty warriors. They are the most hirsute people in the known world. Their flesh is pale, with dark blue veins beneath their skin. Their hair is dark and wiry. Ibbenese men are heavily bearded. Wiry body hair covers their arms, legs, chests, and backs. Interestingly, after the mysterious Mazemakers had vanished, the next earliest mentioned inhabitants of Lorath were said to be a hairy people akin to the men of Ib, and proof of past Ibbenese settlements have been found on Lorath. Furthermore, the World Book has provided us with historical accounts of several run-ins between Ib and the Free City of Lorath over supremacy for shared waters. There have even been historical accounts of conflict between the Sarnori and the Ibbenese for control over the mouth of the Sarn, a river or tributary that had at one point connected both the Shivering and Silver Seas. East of the Axe are the deep blue waters of Bitterweed Bay, where ships from Ib and Lorath have so oft contested for supremacy, and the last great war fleet of the Kingdom of Sarnor was sent to the bottom by the Sea Lord of Braavos. On Ib, these waters are known as Battle Bay, whilst the Lorathi name them Bloody Bay. By any name, 1,000 sunken ships and the bones of 50,000 drowned sailors are said to be strewn across the bay's bottom, home to the crabs for which Bitterweed is renowned. Beyond Bitterweed Bay lies the delta of the Sarn, the great north-flowing river whose many vassal streams drain much of central Essos. The men of Ib have not always confined themselves to their islands. There is abundant evidence of Ibbenese settlements on the Axe, on the Lorathi Isles, and along the shores of the Bitterweed Bay, and the Bay of Tufts in the west, and Leviathan Sound and Thousand Islands in the east. And history tells of several Ibbenese attempts to seize control of the mouth of the Sarn, attempts that brought the hairy men into bloody conflict with the Sarnori sister cities, Soth and Saris. So far we have found several hints that may implicate the Ibbenese as being this mysterious enemy from the sea. But what you might not have caught is that within the myth of the Sarnori hero Huzor Amai, there are hints of this as well. You see, he was said to be born of the last of the Fisher Queens, and we do see hints of this conflict with the Ibbenese, as Huzor Amai was said to have worn about his shoulders a great cloak made from the pelt of the king of the hairy men. And I don't think the king of the hairy men would have given that up willingly. There may also be hints of this conflict displayed in the naming conventions seen within the cities of Essos. As discussed, many of the Sarnori cities contain the ATH or SAR root. It's just another tribute our author pays to the doom that came to Sarnath. Interestingly, our author may be paying tribute in the same way with the city of Lorath, as the same ATH root can be found in a similar way to many of the Sarnori cities. The only other city to be found on the continent of Essos proper with a name containing the ATH would be Kadath, which is another Lovecraft reference, and it's one that we'll be circling round to. But for the moment, what is truly interesting is that within the kingdom of Ib, there is one town on Far Ib that contains the SAR naming convention found in many of the Sarnori cities. And can you guess what Ib-Sar is used for? Far Ib, second largest of the Ibbenese Islands, lies more than 100 leagues southeast of Ib itself, and is altogether a bleaker and poorer place. Ib-Sar, its only town, was originally a place of exile and punishment, where the Ibbenese of old sent their most notorious criminals, often after mutilating them, so they might never return to Ib itself. Basically, Ib-Sar has a bad connotation, associated with criminals and prisoners. This is where the bad people were once sent, originally a place of exile and punishment. It's the Australia of A Song of Ice and Fire, and its naming convention and the nature of its use may also be a hint of this ancient conflict, as we see Ib-Sar is fittingly where prisoners were historically sent. There may also be a small hint of Lorathi influence when we look at Sarnori architecture. Although the Sarnori do not have any maze-like structures that we are immediately aware of, there may be an echo of this labyrinthine style of design within the most famous of Sarnori structures, the Palace with 1,000 Rooms. The Palace with 1,000 Rooms is described as one of Lomas Longstrider's wonders made by man, and is located where else but the city of Sarnath. Although we see little description of this palace with 1,000 rooms, it is probably safe to say that within its walls, it probably wasn't easy to navigate. And this may in fact be another subtle clue, tying this bit of Sarnori architecture to some potential maze-like origins. So, when looking at the origin point of the Fisher Queens, Lorath does appear to have some intriguing evidence and implications, and it appears that what people survived this destruction eventually progressed into what became known as the Sarnori. So, with all that being said, I know what you're thinking. What does this have to do with the base of the High Tower in Old Town? And what does this have to do with the Great Empire of the Dawn? And now this is where it gets interesting. Although we are already given one confirmed civilization that has branched from the fabled Fisher Queens, there are some clues to point toward a second civilization with ties to this fabled Dawn Age society as well. In the World Book, we learn of a matriarchal society of incredibly tall people just south of Yiti on the Isle of Lang, and just as Sarnor and Ib are Lovecraft references, you might be interested to know that like Ib and Sarnor, Lang is also a Lovecraft reference. As mentioned previously, our author seems to be playing off the word Sarnath, with many Sarnori cities containing the SAR or ATH root, with Lorath sharing this root. Now, recall that I had mentioned the only other city on Essos proper to carry this ATH root is the city of Kadath, and one that we would be circling around to. Well, now is the time that we have come full circle. While the Plateau of Lang is mentioned in a small handful of Lovecraft stories, mostly in passing, Lang becomes a place of importance in the dream quest of unknown Kadath, where the main character Carter flies over the Plateau of Lang and finds himself in a windowless monastery composed of black stone, a monastery that he soon discovers is none other than a maze, a labyrinth of twisting passages and stone chambers in which a person could get lost and wander for eternity. So, when we take a closer look at the Isle of Lang and the world our author has created, Lang is one of the more colorful and unique places described in the World Book. While it is said to be home to thousands of monkeys and tigers, the most enigmatic aspect of Lang is its ruins. There are queer ruins in the depths of the island's jungles, massive buildings, long fallen, and so overgrown that rubble remains above the surface. But underground, we are told, endless labyrinths of tunnels lead to vast chambers, and carved steps descend hundreds of feet into the earth. Like the mazes of Lorath, where we have surface structures descending deep into the earth, in Lang, we have the surface which might have been maze-like, but are described as long fallen and rubble. Underground, however, is where the similarities begin to become apparent. Instead of maze-like structures with various underground levels and passages descending 500 feet, the ancient ruins of Lang are described as endless labyrinths of tunnels with carved steps descending hundreds of feet. And when taking into consideration the large skeletons the Mazemakers left, that some scholars have postulated were the result of humans interbreeding with giants, it turns out we also have a match in their physical description, as the people of Lang are incredibly tall, and believed to be the tallest race of man in the known world. On the southern third of Lang dwell the descendants of those displaced by the invaders from the Golden Empire. The native Langi are perhaps the tallest of all the known races of mankind, with many men amongst them reaching 7 feet in height, and some as tall as 8. Long-legged and slender, with flesh the color of oiled teak, they have large golden eyes and can supposedly see farther and better than other men, especially at night. So we see a few fascinating similarities here to Lorath. With Lang, we have labyrinthine underground structures akin to the mazes of Lorath, and the physical description of their people also appears to be a match. Now, as previously discussed, according to the Maesters of Old Town, the base of the High Tower is shrouded in mystery, with the speculation of Valyrian or Mazemaker involvement being brought up as a possibility for the style and nature of its construction. The evidence gathered by the fandom, however, has come to conclude that the High Tower base was likely built by the Great Empire of the Dawn, which is a pretty good bet. Now, what you might not realize is that in the same chapter covering the Great Empire, we also find the Fisher Queens are suggested to have been contemporaries with this empire. At the Citadel of Old Town and other centers of learning in the West, Maesters regard these tales of the Great Empire and its fall as legend, not history. Yet none can doubt that the Yiddish civilization is ancient, mayhaps even contemporary with the realms of the Fisher Queens beside the Silver Sea. What we see is that suspicion has been inserted to raise the possibility both civilizations could have been living and functioning in Essos around the very same time. So, if the Fisher Queens were a Dawn Age seafaring society, given the potential size of the Silver Sea, it seems contact, and possibly even trade, between these two ancient peoples would have been likely. And interestingly enough, the Isle of Lang was also at one point part of the Great Empire. In the beginning, the priestly scribes of Yin declare all the land between the bones and the freezing desert called the Grey Waste, from the Shivering Sea to the Jade Sea, including even the great and holy Isle of Lang, formed a single realm ruled by the god on earth, the only begotten son of the Lion of Night and the Maiden Maid of Light. And now this is going to be important. As previously mentioned, the name given to the Fisher Queen civilization seems to suggest a matriarchal society, one that is ruled by women, which is something rare in both the real-world history and within the world our author has created. What is interesting here is that on top of their tall stature, underground labyrinths, and other shared connections, Lang is also matriarchal. They worship their god empress, and their society appears to follow female primogeniture succession, meaning that the firstborn daughter of the god empress inherits the rule of Lang. In the 4 centuries since Lang threw off the yoke of Yi, the island has flourished under the rule of a long line of god empresses. The first of the current dynasty, still revered in the East as Kiara the Great, was of pure Langi descent. To please her subjects, she took 2 husbands, one Langi and one Yiddish. This custom was continued by her daughters, and their daughters in turn. According to the World Book, the many peoples of the Silver Sea were often either extinguished, driven into exile, or conquered and assimilated by the people who succeeded them. It seems with the abandonment and destruction of Lorath, together with the suggestion of the Fisher Queens being contemporaries with the Great Empire, being driven into exile may have been the case for at least some of their population, and there are hints to this, as there appears to be a shift in the customs of the Great Empire's succession. For 10,000 years, the Great Empire of the Dawn flourished in peace and plenty under the God on earth, until at last he ascended to the stars to join his forebears. Dominion over mankind then passed to his eldest son, who was known as the Pearl Emperor, and ruled for 1,000 years. The Jade Emperor, the Tourmaline Emperor, the Onyx Emperor, the Topaz Emperor, and the Opal Emperor followed in turn, each reigning for centuries, yet every reign was shorter and more troubled than the one preceding it, for wild men and baleful beasts pressed at the borders of the great empire. Lesser kings grew prideful and rebellious, and the people gave themselves over to avarice, envy, lust, murder, incest, gluttony, and sloth. When the daughter of the Opal Emperor succeeded him as the Amethyst Empress, her envious brother cast her down and slew her, proclaiming himself the Bloodstone Emperor and beginning a reign of terror. He practiced dark arts, torture, and necromancy, enslaved his people, took a tiger woman for his bride, feasted on human flesh, and cast down the true gods to worship a black stone that had fallen from the sky. When I was a kid, I had watched a children's program called Sesame Street, where they would play a game called One of These Things Is Not Like the Others. What they would do is give you a bunch of similar things, and one thing that kind of stood out and was different. The object of the game being to identify the one thing that doesn't quite match up with the others. And when looking at the Gemstone Emperors, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but one of these things is not like the others. There seems to be something different here when it comes to the line of succession. Starting with the God on Earth, we have 7 male rulers before the Amethyst Empress inherits the rule of the Great Empire. And while not entirely out of the realm of possibility, it seems highly unlikely the firstborn was always male within that long line of succession. And male primogeniture succession appears to even be implied, with the mention of dominion over mankind passing to the God on Earth's eldest son. This oddity has caused many in the fandom to wonder what had changed, what had caused this shift. There was a male of that line, the Bloodstone Emperor. If males had previously inherited, why was the throne now given to the Amethyst Empress? Well, as we have learned in A Song of Ice and Fire, if a people are newly brought into a kingdom or an empire, it might have been a political move for the king or emperor to wed a woman of their people. Historical precedents of this can be found all throughout the pages of A Song of Ice and Fire. For example, a strong echo of this concept can be found in Dornish history. When Princess Rhaenyra and her people fled their Valyrian conquerors, Rhaenyra took her people and her 10,000 ships into exile beyond the reach of Valyria and settled them in Dorne, where she then wed Mors Martell. This union changed many Dornish customs, particularly succession, from male primogeniture to a succession that disregards gender and relies solely on birth order. The Rhoynar brought with them their customs and their laws, which the Martells then spread throughout Dorne. So in Dorne, alone among the 7 kingdoms, it is the eldest child, man or woman, who will inherit, and not just the eldest son. What is fascinating here is that we may have a pretty on-point parallel, and Rhaenyra may, in symbolic terms, be instructive in some sense, as we have the female ruler fleeing destruction, taking her people into exile thousands of miles on ships, while marrying into and influencing the kingdom that her people are welcomed into. So, if the Fisher Queens had settled Lang, and were brought into the Great Empire, this would explain the Amethyst Empress inheriting rule after what appears to be a long line of male primogeniture succession. This might also explain why her younger brother, the Bloodstone Emperor, had grown envious, because if this is the case, then within their previous system, he, would have been the one to inherit the Great Empire's rule. Interestingly, in The Rogue Prince, while Daemon Targaryen was courting his niece Rhaenyra, he had given her a gift of a tiara, said to have once belonged to an Empress of Lang. Symbolically speaking, this gift is a fitting choice for Rhaenyra, as her storyline closely follows that of the Amethyst Empress, because just as the Amethyst Empress was intended for succession in a system that was previously meant for men, and was later killed by her envious younger brother, Princess Rhaenyra was also given rights of succession in a system that was previously meant for men, and was later cast down, usurped, and killed by her younger brother in much the same fashion. Furthermore, when we go back and examine the passage discussing the Amethyst Empress and the Bloodstone Emperor, this has been a source of confusion for another reason. You see, there are many who believe the Bloodstone Emperor and the Amethyst Empress to be variations of the Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa legends, with the death of the Amethyst Empress being an echo of the death of Nissa Nissa. Now, with that being said, the line about the Bloodstone Emperor taking a tiger woman for a bride has often left readers scratching their heads. Did this mean that Azor Ahai had 2 wives within the Great Empire? Or could this mean that the Amethyst Empress was, in some sense, a tiger woman? Luckily, the fandom has come to a consensus on what a tiger woman might be referring to, and it makes a lot of sense. Lang is said to be the home to thousands of tigers. Moreover, the people of Lang have some very distinguishable features beyond their height. In addition to being incredibly tall, the people of Lang are also known for their large golden eyes, with their keen eyesight and night vision, which is also very cat-like in itself. And given that Lang was part of the Great Empire, many have come to the conclusion that the Tiger Woman was quite possibly a woman of Lang. So, if the Fisher Queen civilization had fled to Lang and were brought into the Great Empire through marriage, then things again begin to make sense and would absolutely make the Amethyst Empress a tiger woman. Because if this is the case, then the Amethyst Empress would in fact be half Langi. This would also explain the legendary hero Huzor Mai, a hero said to be born of the last of the Fisher Queens. As we have already discussed, the Bloodstone Emperor is likely a variation of the Azor Ahai legend, and since the publication of the World Book, the fandom has noticed that Huzor Mai does sound quite a bit like Azor Ahai, causing many in the fandom to have suspicion that this hero might also be a variation of the Azor Ahai legend. Even Elio Garcia and Linda Antonsen, who are co-authors of the World Book, got in on the action, tweeting out that the Grasslands chapter includes a whopper of a detail or a whopper of a red herring, with the hashtag The Prince That Was Promised. Now, with a hashtag like that, there can really be only one thing that they are referring to, and that is Azor Ahai, meaning that the whopper of a detail they were referring to was likely Huzor Mai. Now, as discussed in my video covering the Nissa Nissa monomyth, we had discovered several variations of the Azor Ahai legend, including men such as Hugor of the Hill and Hugo the Hero. In addition to these, the World Book also mentions another variation of a Long Night Savior called Hirkun the Hero. So, by examination of the similarity and evolution of naming conventions, we see this Huzor Mai could also be another version of the Azor Ahai monomyth, not just from the similarity to Azor Ahai alone, but also in comparison to the other mentioned variations. And when taking into consideration what we have just discussed regarding the Fisher Queen civilization and their connection to the Great Empire, it seems as though this may very well be the case. Now, we can only follow the legends and clues and look at what other information our author has given us, but there may also be another clue relating to this in a historical figure who lived only 400 years ago. If the Sarnori do descend from the Fisher Queens as the World Book suggests, then it is quite interesting that later names of historical Sarnori would also retain these very striking linguistic similarities. During the Century of Blood, the Dothraki became unchecked and began conquering cities and kingdoms scattered throughout the grasslands. This Dothraki expansion led to the destruction of the Kingdom of Sarnor, and according to the World Book, the last of the High Kings of Sarnor was named Mazor-Alexi, which is another name that again shares a striking phonetic root to the Azor name, and further suggests a shared linguistic relationship, which is also very interesting because, well, the present kingdom of UT that has replaced the Great Empire in the Far East does not seem to carry any of these linguistic similarities, and instead seems to follow many of the nuances of the Southeast Asian languages of our own world. Ultimately, with everything taken together as a whole, it seems as though Huzhor-Mai and Azor Ahai are variations on the same historical figure, which is indeed one whopper of a detail. So, after understanding the Fisher Queens and the Mazemakers of Lorath were of the same people, a people who would later be brought into the Great Empire through exile and marriage, this would mean that the base of the High Tower is not simply a construct of the Great Empire, and not simply a construct of the Mazemakers, but rather the answer is both. The High Tower is a convergence of architectural accomplishments of both people and both cultures. This is something we see in the Sandship of House Martell, their Rhoynish influence being evident in their towers. A similar convergence can also be seen in the pink marble of the Water Gardens that echoes the pink marble found in Nymeria's city of Nysar. So with that being addressed, the only question that remains is what the nature and purpose of these mazes could be. And to understand that, we need to return to the description of the Langi people. As previously discussed, the Langi are known for having amber, cat-like eyes with keen eyesight and night vision. These physical traits, along with their haunted, subterranean ruins where their gods, known as the Old Ones, may still linger, has caused much speculation surrounding a possible connection or genetic ties to the Children of the Forest, and it's something that I had touched on in my video on the relationship between the Shade of the Evening Tree and the Oily Back Stone. So, if the Langi do descend from the original Mazemakers, then it's possible the Mazemakers of Lorath may have shared the same connection to the children, and their mazes may have shared a similar connection or relationship to the Old Ones or the Old Gods. And with that bit of information, the Mazemaker rivalry between the Ibbenese can be even further explored, because it's also believed that the Ibbenese were responsible for the destruction of the Ifiquevron, who are believed to be the Asosi version of the children. Immediately south of Ib itself, a densely wooded region that had formerly been the home of a small shy forest folk. Some say the Ibbenese extinguished this gentle race, whilst others believe they went into hiding in the deeper woods, or fled to other lands. The Dothraki still call the great forest along the northern coast the Kingdom of the Ifiquevron, the name by which they knew the vanished forest dwellers. The fabled sea snake, Corlys Velaryon, Lord of the Tides, was the first Westerosi to visit these woods. After his return from the Thousand Islands, he wrote of carved trees, haunted grottos, and strange silences. A later traveler, the merchant adventurer Brian of Oldtown, captain of the cog Spearshaker, provided an account of his own journey across the Shivering Sea. He reported that the Dothraki name for the lost people meant, those who walk in the woods. So it is safe to say the Ibbenese did not get along well with these forest folk of Essos, and the Maesters even theorized the Ibbenese were responsible for their extinction. It is also said that the hairy people that inhabited Lorath after its destruction had shunned the mazes of their predecessors. The World Book goes on to describe the mazes of Lorath as haunted during its Andal occupation, and after that occupation, it is said whalers from the port of Ibn would continue to shun the mainland for similar reasons. Thereafter, the Lorathi Isles remained uninhabited for more than a century, and crabs scuttled through the scorched and silent mazes. Whalers from the port of Ibn put ashore to mend their hulls or find fresh water, but they never ventured inland, for the islands were said to be haunted, and the Ibbenese believed any man accursed who went beyond the sound of the sea. So, if the speculation of the Langi and their mazes having ties to the old gods is correct, this would mean the Ibbenese might have been motivated to destroy Lorath beyond control over fishing, seafaring, and trade. In addition to these, the Ibbenese may have been motivated for the same reasons that had caused their genocide of the Epiquevron. Furthermore, if the relationship between the mazes and the old gods is correct, well then we now have some clue as to what these mazes were used for, and there are several clues to support this. For example, we have the blind god Boash. About 1700 years ago, Lorath was settled by a sect of Valyrian religious dissidents who left the freehold to establish a temple upon Lorath's main island. Although I don't believe Boash and the old gods are directly related, I believe this religion may be instructive as to its original purpose. According to the World Book, their eunuch priests wore eyeless hoods in honor of their god. Only in darkness, they believed, would their third eye open, allowing them to see the higher truths of creation that lay concealed behind the world's illusions. According to their faith, the priests of Boash would blind themselves by wearing hoods, and they sought higher truth in the hope that their third eye would open. Does opening a third eye sound familiar? "Fly or die," cried the three-eyed crow as it pecked at him. He wept and pleaded, but the crow had no pity. It put out his left eye and then his right, and when he was blind in the dark, it pecked at his brow, driving its terrible sharp beak deep into his skull. He screamed until he was certain his lungs must burst. The pain was an axe splitting his head apart, but when the crow wrenched out, its beak all slimy with bits of bone and brain, Bran could see again. What he saw made him gasp in fear. He was clinging to a tower miles high, and his fingers were slipping, nails scrabbling at the stone, his legs dragging him down, stupid, useless, dead legs. "Help me," he cried. A golden man appeared in the sky above him and pulled him up. "The things I do for love," he murmured softly, as he tossed him out, kicking into empty air. When Bran Stark is in a coma after his fall, a crow with 3 eyes enters his dreams, and the crow is encouraging him to fly. And like the priests of Boash who walk blindly without their eyesight in order to open their third eye, in this excerpt, we see the three-eyed crow taking both Bran's eyes before Bran is able to open his third. Interestingly, this is not the only line in Bran's chapters alluding to this. "Bran," a voice was whispering softly. "Bran, come back. Come back now, Bran. Bran." He closed his third eye and opened the other 2, the old 2, the blind 2. In the dark place, all men were blind. He remembered who he was all too well. Bran the boy, Bran the broken. Better Bran the beastling. Was it any wonder he would sooner dream his summer dreams, his wolf dreams? Here, in the damp darkness of the tomb, his third eye had finally opened. There he sat, listening to the hoarse whispers of his teacher. "Never fear the darkness, Bran." The Lord's words were accompanied by a faint rustling of wood and leaf, a slight twisting of his head. "The strongest trees are rooted in the dark places of the earth. Darkness will be your cloak, your shield, your mother's milk. Darkness will make you strong." In addition to Bran's dream, where the three-eyed crow symbolically blinds Bran, from what we see from his other chapters, there appears to be a connection between darkness and opening one's third eye. And when compared to the teachings of the religion of Boash, who walk around hooded and blind with the intention of opening one's third eye, it appears this religion may be some corrupted memory or call out to the concept of greensight or the magic of the old gods, and this may be their attempt to recreate that magic. In A Dance with Dragons, we are briefly introduced to a parallel religion called the Pattern, who also use mazes in a way that echoes the religion of Boash. Those are the stones of the silent god, and there, the entrance to the Pattern Maker's maze. Only those who learn to walk it properly will ever find their way to wisdom, the priests of the Pattern say. Like the religion of Boash, whose priests walk blindly in search of enlightenment, higher truths, and opening one's third eye, with the religion of the pattern, it is said those who learn to walk the maze properly will find their way to wisdom. So far we have higher truths, opening a third eye, and wisdom. So it appears both religions associated with mazes seem to have similar goals and beliefs. Interestingly, like the priests of Boash, whose religion may hold some memory of the old gods, it appears the followers of the many-faced god of the House in Black and White may also hold such a memory. When the House of Black and White is introduced in the series, we are given a symbol of the old gods in the form of weirwood and ebony doors with a carved face that remind Arya of the heart tree in Winterfell, and are meant to be evocative to the reader, as this is the first thing Arya comes across and must pass through when entering the House of Black and White. In addition to weirwood and ebony doors, we also learn that the faceless men sit on weirwood and ebony chairs, that many readers have noticed is reminiscent of greenseers who sit on weirwood thrones. And this is all interesting when it comes to the House of Black and White, but this is far from new commentary. What I want to draw your attention to is the similarity to the religion of Boash. You see, during Arya's training, she encounters several blind acolytes, and later, she herself becomes blinded. It seems being blinded is part of the training and indoctrination into the Faceless Men. The kindly man had told her that they would have taken her eyes from her anyway, to help her to learn to use her other senses, but not for half a year. Blind acolytes were common in the House of Black and White, but few as young as she. After Arya is blinded, her first lesson she is given is learning to traverse the tunnels of the subterranean passages underneath the House of Black and White. "How long must I be blind?" she would ask. "Until darkness is as sweet to you as light," the waif would say, "or until you ask us for your eyes. Ask and you shall see. And then you will send me away. Better blind than that." They would not make her yield. On the day she had woken blind, the waif took her by the hand and led her through the vaults and tunnels of the rock on which the House of Black and White was built, up the steep stone steps into the temple proper. "Count the steps as you climb," she had said. "Let your fingers brush the wall. There are markings there, invisible to the eye, plain to the touch." That was her first lesson. There had been many more. So Arya is blinded and taught to walk the underground passageways beneath the House of Black and White. And when she asks when she will regain her eyesight, the response is, quote, "Until darkness becomes as sweet to you as light." Interestingly, it is not until Arya is able to open her third eye that she is finally given her eyesight back. The price of slaves is rising, they said, and there are thousands more women and children at Hardhome. It is good to know. This is 2. Is there a third? Yes. I know that you're the one who's been hitting me. Her stick lashed out and cracked against his fingers, sending his own stick clattering to the floor. The priest winced and snatched his hand back. "And how could a blind girl know that?" "I saw you." "I gave you 3. I don't need to give you 4. Maybe on the morrow she would tell him about the cat that had followed her home last night from Pintos, the cat that was hiding in the rafters, looking down on them. Or maybe not. If he could have secrets, so could she. That same evening, Arya is given something to drink, and when she wakes the next morning, her eyesight has returned. So in a sense, just as we have the religion of Boash, who walk about blinded in the hopes of opening one's third eye, with the religion of the many-faced god, the acolytes who are to become faceless men are also blinded, and are not given their eyesight back until darkness is as sweet as light to them. And in Arya's case, her first task was walking the underground passages of the House of Black and White, and she was only given her eyesight back after opening her third eye and skin-changing a cat. Additionally, the underground caves, tunnels, and passageways beneath the House of Black and White are also reminiscent of the underground passageways mentioned on both Lang and Lorath. So, with all of the werewood imagery, the blinding of their acolytes, and in Arya's case, the opening of her third eye, it appears the religion of the many-faced god might also hold some memory of skin changing. And what is even more fascinating is that the followers of the many-faced god mimic something very close to skin changing, where they literally change their skin. And this is just scratching the surface. For a full analysis on the connection between the faceless men and the children of the forest, I would strongly encourage you to check out Maester Mary's YouTube, Up From Under Winterfell, where she fully explores these connections in both parts 2 and 3 of her series called In the Shadow of the Titan. So, after discussing this, let's take a look at a throwaway line in Daenerys 2 of A Clash of Kings, when she is in Zoan Daxos' palace. She would have her own gardens, a marble bathing pool, a scrying tower, and Warlock's maze. Slaves would tend her every need. In her private chambers, the floors were green marble, the walls draped with colorful silk hangings that shimmered with every breath of air. A Warlock's maze. Warlocks are known for being a sorceress group who drink from a substance made from the shade of the evening tree. If you have watched my video on the shade of the evening tree and the oily black stone, you will know that the shade tree is something of an analog to the werewood tree, as both trees are magical and have the potential to both extend life and provide visions. In that video, I discuss how the two trees are simply lighter and darker versions of one another. So, in a sense, ingesting Shade of the Evening is in some way equivalent to ingesting werewood paste. For example, think of Bran having dreams of flying as a boy, and of Euron also disclosing that he has had dreams of flying as a boy, but instead of ingesting werewood paste, he drinks Shade of the Evening. Will this make me a greenseer? Your blood makes you a greenseer, said Lord Brynden. This will help awaken your gifts and wed you to the trees. Bran did not want to be married to a tree, but who else would wed a broken boy like him? 1,000 eyes, 100 skins, wisdom as deep as the roots of ancient trees, a greenseer? He ate. It had a bitter taste, though not so bitter as acorn paste. The first spoonful was the hardest to get down. He almost retched it right back up. The second tasted better. The third was almost sweet. The rest he spooned up eagerly. Why had he thought that it was bitter? It tasted of honey, of new-fallen snow, of pepper and cinnamon and the last kiss his mother ever gave him. And now compare this to Dany drinking Shade of the Evening. Will it turn my lips blue? One flute will serve only to unstop your ears and dissolve the call from off your eyes, so that you may hear and see the truths that will be laid before you. Dany raised the glass to her lips. The first sip tasted like ink and spoiled meat. Foul. But when she swallowed, it seemed to come to life within her. She could feel tendrils spreading through her chest, like fingers of fire coiling around her heart. And on her tongue was a taste like honey and anise and cream, like mother's milk and Drogo's seed, like red meat and hot blood and molten gold. It was all the taste she had ever known, and none of them. There are some striking similarities between both the two trees and the two substances, and like the priests of Boash, who walk around blinded and hooded in order to seek truth and open one's third eye, we see some parallels here when Dany is given a substance to, quote, remove the call from her eyes so that she may see truths. In the Reaver chapter of A Feast for Crows, when Euron offers Victarion the shade drink, he tells his brother that he means to, quote, open his eyes. And when he forces Aeron to drink the shade substance in the Forsaken chapter, he states that the wine has more truth in it than all the gods on earth. So we see several connections when it comes to the idea of seeking truth, wisdom, and opening one's third eye, in addition to their connection to the trees and the magic of the children. Now, with the mention of the Warlock's Maze in Zoan Daxos' mansion, this seems more like a novel architectural addition that someone incredibly wealthy might add and probably serves no real meaningful purpose. But it is probably an architectural nod to something more significant, the fact that warlocks have mazes. And with that in mind, There is a warlock's maze hidden within the pages of A Song of Ice and Fire, and it's one that Archmaester Emma of the Red Mice at Play WordPress had pointed out. Let's take a closer look at the House of Dust. In Daenerys 4 of A Clash of Kings, when Daenerys first approaches the House of the Undying, she takes note of the exterior of the building. Long and low, without towers or windows, it coiled like a stone serpent through a grove of black-barked trees, whose inky blue leaves made the stuff of the sorcerer's drink the Carthene called Shade of the Evening. So Dany notes the House of Dust is a long and low, windowless building, with an odd shape said to coil like a serpent. Then she addresses Pyat Pri before entering. When she questioned him, the warlock said only, "The front way leads in, but never out again. Heed my words, Queen. The House of the Undying Ones was not made for mortal men. If you value your soul, take care and do just as I tell you." Then he goes on to say, "When you enter, you will find yourself in a room with 4 doors, the one you have come through and 3 others. Take the door to your right. Each time, the door to your right. If you should come upon a stairwell, climb, never go down, and never take any door but the first door to your right." "The door to my right," Dany repeated. "I understand. And when I leave, the opposite?" "By no means," Pyat Pri said. "Leaving and coming it is the same, always up, always the door to your right. Other doors may open to you. Within you may see things that disturb you, visions of loveliness and visions of horror, wonders and terrors, sights and sounds of days gone by and days to come, and days that never were. Dwellers and servitors may speak to you as you go. Answer or ignore them as you choose, but enter no room until you reach the audience chamber." So, did you catch that? This place was not built for mortal men. She should follow his instructions if she values her soul. The door you go in will not be the door you come out. Leaving and coming are the same. Always the door to your right. Always climb. Then she is given the shade of the evening in order to dissolve the call from her eyes, so that she can see and hear the truths that will be laid before her. Then she enters and begins to follow the instructions given to her. Dany enters several halls and chambers, always taking the door to her right, and always climbing. The long hall went on and on and on, with endless doors to her left and only torches to her right. She ran past more doors than she could count, closed doors and open ones, doors of wood and doors of iron, carved doors and plain ones, doors with pulls and doors with locks and doors with knockers. Drogon lashed against her back, urging her on, and Dany ran until she could run no more. Daenerys continues through this structure, all while obtaining prophetic visions and higher truths, but at one point she does almost get lost. Yet another torch went out as she stood pondering, and the sounds grew faintly louder. Drogon's neck snaked out, and he opened his mouth to scream, steam rising from between his teeth. He hears it too. Dany turned to the blank wall once more, but there was nothing. Could there be a secret door? A door I cannot see? Another torch went out. Another. "The first door on the right," he said. "Always the first door on the right." The first door on the right, it came to her suddenly, is the last door on the left. She flung herself through. Beyond was another small room with 4 doors. To the right she went, and to the right, 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 until she was dizzy and out of breath once more. Now do you see how this is a maze? Also, note that during her travels she has to climb stairs again and again. If you recall, there were no towers. The building was described as long and low. Dany left him behind, entering a stairwell. She began to climb. Before long, her legs were aching. She recalled that the House of the Undying Ones had seemed to have no towers. Finally, the stair opened. To her right, a set of wide wooden doors had been thrown open. They were fashioned of ebony and weirwood, the black and white grain swirling and twisting in strange, interwoven patterns. So, here is a question. If a building is described as long and low, It sounds as though the House of Dust might be 1 or maybe 2 levels, yet Dany is climbing, which she thinks to herself as being odd because the building had no towers. Now, we should understand that in this chapter, Dany is something of an unreliable narrator and has taken a mind-altering substance before entering. So really, there could be several explanations for this. But whatever the case may be, it is something we should be aware of, because if she is in fact climbing, well then that would mean that the tunnels and chambers she had gone through were slowly descending. And in a windowless building, it would be difficult to detect if you were making a gradual descent. And if this is the case, this would mean that the passages and tunnels in the House of the Undying led underground. Also, the final chamber that led to the Undying Ones should be carefully examined as well, because the doors to the Undying Ones are described as a mixture of ebony and weirwood. So, in addition to being surrounded by the shade of the evening, and Dany ingesting the substance before she enters, and having to traverse a maze, we are also being given a symbol of the old gods directly before Dany enters the Undying audience chamber. And just as the religions of Boash and the Pattern walk these mazes in search of wisdom and opening one's third eye, the reason Dany had entered the House of the Undying Ones was also in the quest for wisdom and truth, which she received in the form of visions. Or, said another way, after opening her third eye. In case you haven't noticed by now, when looking at everything as a whole, there is something thematic going on. With the religion of Boash, they walk blinded, attempting to find higher truth and open their third eye. With the religion of the Pattern, they walk the maze in search of wisdom. And we also see Dany traversing the House of the Undying in search of truth and knowledge of things to come. It was throughout this exploration that connections between the mazes and the magic of the old gods was identified. So, after understanding the old ones lurking under the haunted ruins of Leng might be connected to the old gods, and that the haunted ruins of Lorath might have been used for the same purpose, it seems the breadcrumbs our author has been leaving us regarding mazes is pointing us toward that direction as well. Furthermore, the thing that seems to connect these concepts is man's attempt to recreate or unlock that magic in their attempts to find wisdom, truth, visions, and to open one's third eye. So, knowing these mazes were made by man, it's possible the mazes of Leng, Lorath, and even Battle Isle might have been used with that objective in mind, which is coincidentally very reminiscent of the plot of the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which, like many of Lovecraft's stories, is essentially the quest for forbidden knowledge. In Dream Quest, the dream world is accessible when one is asleep, and the main character dreams of a majestic city, but he is unable to enter or approach it on the dream plane, and when he prays to the gods to reveal the city's whereabouts, his dreams of this majestic city are altogether taken away. In response, Carter consults priests in the Dreamlands, who suggest the gods had purposefully stopped his visions due to their great danger, suggesting this to be a forbidden knowledge. Instead of getting the hint that the city is off limits, Carter continues on his quest to find this city within the dream plane, which then leads him to Leng and the labyrinth within. Ultimately, the overarching theme in Dream Quest is simply a metaphor for man reaching for knowledge that should not be touched. And just as we have the old ones thought to lurk under the labyrinthine tunnels of Leng, in Dream Quest, an elder deity also lurks within the labyrinthine monastery of Leng, an archaic god named Nodens. Nodens is known as the Lord of the Great Abyss. The Great Abyss being not a place, but rather a concept that separates humans from the universe of genuine knowledge. And interestingly enough, this Lovecraft deity just so happens to be inspired by a Celtic deity of the same name, a deity believed to have had in some part inspired the Fisher King of Arthurian legend, giving us just another connection to the Fisher Queens within our author's world. So, after understanding these concepts, when looking at everything as a whole, the mazes of the Mazemakers might have been used in search of forbidden knowledge, an instrument for man to obtain the magic and the wisdom of the old gods. And if that is the case, then what is truly terrifying is not the base of the high tower itself, but in truth, we should be more concerned about what is underneath it, and who might have the knowledge and resources to use it for its intended purpose. Well, that about wraps things up for today. For those interested in learning more about the underground passageways in various parts of A Song of Ice and Fire, please check out Wiz the Smith's essay entitled The Caves Are Timeless, as well as Maester Mary's previously mentioned work entitled In the Shadow of the Titan. Links to everything are in the description box below. I know this was a long one, so thank you to everyone who stuck with me until the end. I hope you enjoyed it, and again, thanks for watching.
If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching!